St. George's Hall. The television cameras are rolling, broadcasting a routine ceremony of global continuity to millions across the earth. Then, without warning, the rhythm breaks. The king stops mid-sentence, his hand trembles against the parchment, and his eyes lock instantly onto his eldest son. In that single, unscripted second of absolute silence, the modern history of the British monarchy changed forever. Long before the public heard a single whisper, before the press rooms mobilized, or the palace gates swung shut, a secret clock had already begun to tick behind closed doors. This is not the story of a sudden institutional collapse, but of the calculated, agonizing architecture of an exit. It is the untold account of the day the ultimate symbol of permanent power chose to bend to the reality of human limitation, rewriting the rules of succession forever. The grand reception rooms of Windsor Castle are meticulously engineered to project a sense of timeless permanence, but on a remarkably quiet afternoon, the cold atmosphere inside suggested something entirely different. Prince William did not enter the council room as a son preparing to discuss his father's health or a temporary adjustment to the royal diary. He entered as the future king, carrying an institutional truth that could no longer remain hidden behind palace doors. Catherine stood beside him, silent but visibly grounded, as he confirmed to a highly restricted gathering of senior household figures that King Charles had approved a formal abdication timeline. The crown was not changing hands in some distant, abstract future. It was moving toward a fixed, deeply deliberate end. Under conditions of absolute secrecy, the prince had summoned the most senior officials of the royal household. Personal communication devices were removed before the heavy oak doors closed, and every advisor in attendance understood, without it being stated, that nothing spoken within those four walls could leave the room. Catherine watched her husband take his place at the head of the table, aware that this meeting was entirely distinct from previous discussions regarding the temporary delegation of royal duties. Those arrangements had been practiced before mechanisms that allowed counselors of state or the heir apparent to step in when the monarch was temporarily incapacitated. This was fundamentally different. This concerned the formal, permanent surrender of sovereign authority. The prince allowed the room to settle into a heavy silence before he spoke. When he finally delivered the words, they carried a weight that no one in the room was truly prepared to absorb. The king had approved an abdication process scheduled to commence within 6 months, with the final constitutional transfer of authority planned before the end of the year. That authority represented the legal and symbolic power held by the reigning monarch. Once transferred, the king would step back completely, and his eldest son would inherit every institutional burden the crown carried. Catherine noticed the distinct change in William's breathing as he spoke, the definitive words confirming that the king would step down. He paused afterward, caught between two identities that the realities of the modern era would no longer allow him to separate. The heir was accepting what institutional duty demanded, while the son was directly confronting the decline of a father he had spent his entire life trying to understand. In the silence that followed, one senior advisor quietly inquired whether the monarch might eventually reconsider or reverse the decision. William kept his voice meticulously controlled, though his hand tightened visibly around the back of his chair. He answered firmly that the timeline had not been forced upon the sovereign by constitutional officials or political pressure. His father had personally requested a fixed date after receiving a private assessment that fundamentally altered how he viewed the future of his reign. Catherine then broke her silence, drawing from a documented account prepared specifically for those present at the table. She revealed that the official household announcement had been intentionally delayed for several days because the king insisted on speaking privately with Queen Camilla before any administrative machinery was set in motion. The queen consort had been informed well before the wider household, and the gravity of that conversation had left both the monarch and his wife deeply shaken. William placed a sealed red folder onto the center of the table but chose not to open it. Every date inside, he explained, had been approved in his father's own handwriting. The timetable was officially clear. The profound human reality behind it was not. The abdication date had been fixed, but behind that bureaucratic reality stood a father, a son, a wife, and a future queen, each navigating a different facet of the exact same institutional pressure. The monarchy could easily describe abdication through the lens of statutes, signatures, privy councils, and ancient ceremony. Yet no official constitutional language could explain what the decision actually meant within the private quarters of the royal family. For Charles, it represented the surrender of a destiny he had waited decades to fulfill. For William, it was an inheritance arriving with uncomfortable speed. For Catherine, it meant a massive expansion of duty overnight. And for Camilla, it felt like a carefully planned future was being abruptly taken away. To understand how the institution reached this point, one must look back to the moment the public narrative began to fracture. For weeks, the official line from the palace explained the king significantly reduced schedule as a matter of standard caution. The family, the media, and the public accepted shorter appearances, altered travel routes, and extended private rest periods without openly asking the question nobody wanted answered. Then came the Commonwealth Oath ceremony at St. George's Hall, a formal gathering where the sovereign traditionally renews a public promise of service to the nations connected through the Commonwealth. Charles had insisted on attending. In his mind, continuity depended entirely on the crown appearing steady, even when the man carrying it was not. The king began the ceremony with visible control. Then, halfway through the text, he lost his place on the page. He searched the lines, tried to continue, and found nothing. William saw the flash of vulnerability before anyone else in the hall did. When his father silently gestured toward the final passage of the text, the prince stepped forward and completed the reading before the assembled officials. The ceremony continued without a break, and the monarchy did not pause, but something fundamental inside the king had broken. After finishing the remaining formalities, Charles immediately withdrew into a private antechamber beside the ceremonial hall. He refused all physical assistance, closed the door firmly, and remained entirely alone for nearly 20 minutes. No aides entered, no advisors spoke. Outside the door, William stood with the sudden, sharp knowledge that he had just taken his father's place before an audience that understood exactly what it had witnessed. The prince felt no sense of triumph, only a profound sense of exposure. Later, in a private conversation with Catherine, William admitted that finishing the oath had not felt like a helpful preparation for kingship. It had felt like witnessing an ending while everyone in the room pretended the situation was still under control. The silence that followed the moment his father stopped speaking had frightened him far more than the pressure of the ceremony itself. It was that very evening that Charles made his definitive choice. He requested the sovereign transition files, the emergency papers prepared to guide the transfer of royal authority if a reigning monarch could no longer continue. It was the first time in his reign he had asked for them voluntarily. On the first page, the king added a brief, handwritten note. The monarchy must never face another public moment in which uncertainty reached the throne before preparation did. The following morning, Catherine visited the king privately. He admitted to her that watching William complete the oath had shown him something painful but entirely undeniable. The crown had continued without interruption, even while he stood unable to speak. His son had protected the institution, yet in doing so, the prince had also revealed how close the ending had become. The ceremony had convinced the king that the succession could no longer be delayed, but when father and son finally sat down to face the transition files together, duty collided with personal wounds that neither man had spoken aloud for years. No advisors remained in the room for that pivotal meeting, no secretaries waiting beside the wall. Charles sat at one end of the table with the red abdication file before him, while William stood at the other, initially refusing to take the empty chair. What began as a highly technical discussion about constitutional dates quickly devolved into something far more personal, a direct confrontation over fear, sacrifice, and the unspoken belief that one man was surrendering his life's work while the other was actively advancing. King Charles wanted the transition completed swiftly, within 4 months. He argued that prolonged uncertainty would weaken both the government and the royal household, leaving officials unsure of who carried final responsibility. To the monarch, speed meant maintaining control over his own exit. To his son, however, it looked like a family being forced to alter their entire lives before they had even begun to understand the cost. William asked for more time. He did not ask because he feared the role of king, but because Catherine would become queen beside him, and their children would instantly move to the absolute center of the succession. Schools, security details, patronages, and household staff would all have to adjust simultaneously. The future king knew the crown could survive a rapid bureaucratic transition. He was far less certain his family could survive the sudden shockwave. Hearing this hesitation, Charles answered with a rare flash of anger, accusing the prince of treating the timeline as negotiable after spending years advocating for a more modern, decisive, and streamlined monarchy. William did not raise his voice. He simply replied that he had wanted institutional reform, not his father's sudden disappearance. Only then did the prince finally sit down, as the king's angry expression shifted into something entirely different. The frustration vanished, leaving only a profound sense of hurt. Charles pushed the red folder across the table and told his son to choose another date himself. William refused to touch it. He pushed it back, stating firmly that the final date had to belong entirely to the man leaving the throne, not the one preparing to receive it. The words landed harder than either man expected. The monarch finally confessed what had truly driven his sudden urgency. He deeply feared remaining in office too long, leaving a legacy defined by a family forced to conceal his physical weakness. William countered with his own private beer, noting that history might portray him as the impatient heir who capitalized on his father's suffering. Neither man wanted victory. Both deeply feared the judgment of history. In a slow, deliberate movement, Charles removed his signet ring, the personal seal traditionally used to represent royal authority, and placed it gently beside the folder. For one long, tense moment, William stared at the gold band resting on the table. Then, just as slowly, the king put it back on his finger. The king was preparing to leave, but he had just laid down the one thing his son was not yet ready to pick up. An abdication may begin with a monarch's private decision, but it cannot be completed by emotion alone. Behind the thick, insulating palace walls, away from the quiet grief of the family quarters, the clinical machinery of the British state began to assume total control of the narrative. Constitutional advisors, legal officers, senior courtiers, and government representatives met in windowless rooms to construct a transitional path that left absolutely no room for institutional confusion. Every sentence drafted in these meetings carried immense constitutional weight. Every date selected carried immediate operational consequences for the British state. Yet, at the center of these cold calculations sat one increasingly exhausted man, listening in silence as outside experts explained precisely how his lifelong reign would formally end. King Charles heard the detailed process described in exact, unyielding terms. Parliament would require formal notification and preparation for the necessary legislative adjustments. Security arrangements would need a complete overhaul across multiple royal residences. Succession plans would be systematically activated, and a formal proclamation would eventually confirm William as the new king. A proclamation was not a mere theatrical tradition, it was the definitive public announcement that established the legal continuity of the new monarch. The sovereign could choose to step aside voluntarily, but strict constitutional procedures still had to carry that personal choice into hard law without leaving the nation, the Commonwealth, or the government with even a single day of uncertainty regarding who held ultimate authority. The institutional pressure tightened significantly when senior advisors warned the family that the public timetable, once declared, could not be treated as flexible or subject to change. Once the dates were announced to the public, any subsequent delay, hesitation, or reversal would cause severe, potentially irreversible damage to public confidence in both Charles and William. The king understood the systemic danger immediately. A failed or stuttering abdication process would make him appear completely indecisive to the global public, while leaving his son trapped in a deeply uncomfortable position between personal loyalty and institutional ambition. The future king would inherit a wave of public suspicion long before he inherited the actual throne. It was the exact trap the House of Windsor had spent 90 years trying to avoid. In 1936, Edward VIII stepped off the throne and directly into an absolute social exile, creating a constitutional tremor that nearly cracked the foundation of the crown. Charles was not fleeing a romance or a scandal, he was negotiating a controlled, modern exit. Yet the state machinery treated both men with the exact same coldness, prioritizing the preservation of the office over the emotional reality of the person occupying it. Queen Camilla, however, refused to accept the sheer speed of this bureaucratic transition without a challenge. In highly charged private meetings, she demanded firm guarantees that her husband would not be suddenly reduced to a completely retired, powerless figure without influence, dignity, or direct access to the institution he had served for decades. The queen consort argued forcefully that Charles had given his entire life to the service of the monarchy and could not simply be erased from its inner workings by administrative efficiency. Her anger was strictly controlled, as decades of royal discipline demanded, but everyone present in the room could hear the profound fear beneath her words. An abdication may begin with a monarch's private decision, but it cannot be completed by emotion alone. Behind the thick, insulating palace walls, away from the quiet grief of the family quarters, the clinical machinery of the British state began to assume total control of the narrative. Constitutional advisors, legal officers, senior courtiers, and government representatives met in windowless rooms to construct a transitional path that left absolutely no room for institutional confusion. Every sentence drafted in these meetings carried immense constitutional weight. Every date selected carried immediate operational consequences for the British state. Yet, at the center of these cold calculations sat one increasingly exhausted man, listening in silence as outside experts explained precisely how his lifelong reign would formally end. King Charles heard the detailed process described in exact, unyielding terms. Parliament would require formal notification and preparation for the necessary legislative adjustments. Security arrangements would need a complete overhaul across multiple royal residences. Succession plans would be systematically activated, and a formal proclamation would eventually confirm William is the new king. A proclamation was not a mere theatrical tradition. It was the definitive public announcement that established the legal continuity of the new monarch. The sovereign could choose to step aside voluntarily, but strict constitutional procedures still had to carry that personal choice into hard law without leaving the nation, the Commonwealth, or the government with even a single day of uncertainty regarding who held ultimate authority. The institutional pressure tightened significantly when senior advisors warned the family that the public timetable, once declared, could not be treated as flexible or subject to change. Once the dates were announced to the public, any subsequent delay, hesitation, or reversal would cause severe, potentially irreversible damage to public confidence in both Charles and William. The king understood the systemic danger immediately. A failed or stuttering abdication process would make him appear completely indecisive to the global public, while leaving his son trapped in a deeply uncomfortable position between personal loyalty and institutional ambition. The future king would inherit a wave of public suspicion long before he inherited the actual throne. It was the exact trap the House of Windsor had spent 90 years trying to avoid. In 1936, Edward VIII stepped off the throne and directly into an absolute social exile, creating a constitutional tremor that nearly cracked the foundation of the crown. Charles was not fleeing a romance or a scandal, he was negotiating a controlled, modern exit. Yet the state machinery treated both men with the exact same coldness, prioritizing the preservation of the office over the emotional reality of the person occupying it. Queen Camilla, however, refused to accept the sheer speed of this bureaucratic transition without a challenge. In highly charged private meetings, she demanded firm guarantees that her husband would not be suddenly reduced to a completely retired, powerless figure without influence, dignity, or direct access to the institution he had served for decades. The queen consort argued forcefully that Charles had given his entire life to the service of the monarchy and could not simply be erased from its inner workings by administrative efficiency. Her anger was strictly controlled as decades of royal discipline demanded, but everyone present in the room could hear the profound fear beneath her words. Charles remained entirely silent until an official, reading directly from a draft transitional scenario, referred to him by the legal term the former sovereign. The king's expression tightened instantly. He looked up, his voice quiet but sharp, and asked for the phrase to be repeated aloud. The sovereign meant the reigning monarch who holds the crown's full legal authority. In that clinical room, the addition of the word former sounded less like a legal explanation and far more like an administrative eraser designed to remove his identity completely. The institutional shock deepened significantly when a private council document revealed that Charles would lose all normal access to state papers immediately following the abdication. He had approved the initial timeline without fully grasping this specific constitutional restriction. State papers, the red briefing boxes containing highly confidential government documents, intelligence reports, and minutes prepared daily for the reigning monarch, had been the central rhythm of his working life for years. To lose them meant total isolation from the governance of the realm. This specific restriction highlighted the intense, behind-the-scenes friction between the palace and the Prime Minister's office. The executive branch of the government operates on the strict principle that there can only be one source of constitutional counsel to the Prime Minister. To allow a retired monarch continuous access to live state intelligence would create an unprecedented duplication of authority. Political advisors feared that an active, highly experienced former king receiving the same intelligence briefs as his son could lead to conflicting behind-the-scenes interventions, disrupting the smooth execution of government policy and shifting real-world geopolitics. For the civil service, a clean break was an operational necessity. For the king, it felt like political banishment. Seeing his father's sudden realization, William quietly intervened. The prince requested that senior officials draft a new protocol ensuring regular, personal briefings for his father. providing him with high-level overviews without creating the constitutional appearance of two competing royal courts or dual authorities. Catherine, sitting nearby, noticed the king silently folding and unfolding the corner of a memorandum page again and again, a classic sign of deep internal distress. She gently reached across, took the file from his hands to stop the repetitive motion, and calmly asked the room for a temporary pause in the proceedings. She had managed to protect Charles's emotional dignity without publicly weakening his authority in front of the officials, and the king silently allowed her to do it. The brief pause, however, changed nothing about the wider institutional reality. The legal structure was becoming clearer by the hour, but as the new administrative order began to seep into the private quarters of the family, constitutional necessity began to feel indistinguishable from personal punishment. The abdication had not yet been announced to the wider nation, yet the palace machinery was already actively moving and shifting around it. Briefing boxes quietly changed their daily courier routes, security teams received updated protocols, and William's office assumed direct authority over decisions that had belonged exclusively to Charles only days earlier. The transition was designed to protect the monarchy from external shock, but to those losing access, influence, and a lifetime of identity, it felt as though the king were being systematically erased while he was still physically wearing the crown. Camilla discovered the true extent of this shift not through a formal meeting, but through her own daily diary. A long-standing, personally significant meeting she had scheduled had been quietly transferred to Catherine's office without any personal explanation or prior consultation. As the clinical glare of the television lights faded, the sharp scraping of packing tape against cardboard echoed through the private apartments, signaling that the administrative transition had already outpaced the family's emotional readiness. The Queen Consort read the altar calendar entry twice in disbelief before confronting Charles in his study. She asked him directly why everyone else in the palace appeared to know exactly what she was losing before she was even given the courtesy of an explanation. Her anger was not merely about a single displaced meeting. It was about the painful reality of becoming secondary within the institution before the abdication timeline had even formally begun. Charles looked at her, his eyes filled with exhaustion, and told her gently that these administrative adjustments were completely unavoidable under the approved timeline. Camilla removed her diary from the desk, closed it with a sharp, definitive snap, and replied that inevitability was not the same thing as kindness. The king heard the deep accusation beneath those words, and it stung. He had personally promised her that she would retain absolute dignity throughout the transition, yet the bureaucratic institution was already treating her very future as nothing more than a tedious administrative problem to be solved. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered beneath a light rain. There were no great cheers, nor were there any angry chants. Strangers simply spoke quietly among themselves about duty, age, and the profound nature of royal sacrifice. Some mourned what felt like an unfinished chapter of British history, while others saw immense strength in a monarch who chose to step aside before the institution was forced to carry his weakness. The next morning, a leading national newspaper published a full-page image of Charles and William walking side by side under a simple headline, "A father's final gift to his son." A prominent broadcaster called it the first modern royal transition shaped openly by vulnerability rather than death. A phrase that spread rapidly because it captured the deeply human truths behind the palace walls. It was a family admitting its own limitations before those limitations could trigger an institutional collapse. The full statement confirmed that Charles had chosen the timetable entirely of his own volition, but it also highlighted the formal protections William had requested to preserve his father's ceremonial dignity after the handover. These protections ensured the former sovereign would retain a meaningful life of public service without ever challenging the legal authority of the new king. Watching the broadcast privately from her quarters, Camilla wept as she heard her husband state clearly to the world that he was not abandoning service, but merely changing the form in which he gave it. She had spent weeks fearing a cold, bureaucratic erasure. Instead, she heard him define his departure as an ultimate act of devotion. Ultimately, the abdication timeline began as tragic news because it marked the definitive end of a reign before the king was truly ready to stop caring. Yet, its deepest historical meaning was not found in the date Charles surrendered the crown, but in the precise manner of his departure. He chose to step away before uncertainty could weaken the crown, and William chose to receive it without allowing duty to erase the man who passed it down. When Charles formally signed the approved timetable during their final private family meeting, He set down his pen and slid the document across the table toward his son. The prince placed his hand over the signature, but did not immediately pull the page toward himself. For one silent, profound moment, neither man moved. The room was entirely still. The act of abdication was not a defeat, nor was it a symptom of institutional failure. It was the king's final, most mature sovereign decision. It was a sacrifice made entirely to guarantee long-term stability, to shield his son from a chaotic inheritance, and to prevent personal pride from ever placing the crown at risk. When the crown finally passes from father to son, history will look back on this chapter not as a story of decline, but as a story of evolution. It will remember that King Charles's last and greatest act as a reigning monarch was not the stubborn holding of absolute power, but the profound wisdom of knowing exactly when to place it safely in William's hands.